One day in November 1903,
In June of
Marie Curie
2005,
and her
Pharaoh
husband got a
Judah
letter
struck
in the mail.
California.
The letter
James
got
Goodall
told
traveled
half
from
a million
Sweden
to Sweden
to
to the king and
Sweden.
queen. This is Who Was with Miss Wren.
Who was Susan B. Anthony? Chapter 7. Been and Gone and Done It. The split between the National and the American women's suffrage groups was still bitter. The American, unlike the National, allowed men to hold office. Henry Ward Beecher was its first president. He tried to get all women's suffrage organizations to become part of the American. By this time, Susan was almost 50. She was becoming a legend in the United States. The press called her Napoleon, after the French emperor who conquered most of Europe, Bismarck, after the politician who made Germany a strong power, and the General. At her birthday party that year, she stood up to speak to a group of her friends who had gathered to celebrate. She was tongue-tied. She explained, "If this were an assembled mob opposing the rights of women, I should know what to say." At this point in her life, Susan was more prepared to speak to complete strangers on women's suffrage than to her own dear friends. Susan went home to Rochester just in time to vote in the national election of 1872. By voting, Susan was declaring that she believed she ought to have the right to vote. Her sisters, Guelma, Mary, and Hannah, went with her. Afterward, she wrote to Elizabeth, "Well, I have been and gone and done it. Positively voted the Republican ticket, straight, this a.m. at 7 o'clock, and swore my vote in at that." 3 weeks later, Susan was arrested for her vote. She was offered bail. That meant she could pay money as a promise that she would not run away before her trial. Susan refused to pay. But her lawyer, Henry Selden, couldn't bear to see a lady he respected in jail. Even though his actions interfered with what Susan was trying to do, Selden paid the bail money to get Susan out of jail. Susan's trial began June 17, 1873. The judge was Associate Justice Ward Hunt. Hunt believed that Susan was not smart enough to speak for herself because she was a woman. Selden argued for her. When they were finished, Judge Hunt pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was his decision. He had written it before he had even listened to what Susan's lawyer had to say. Hunt told the jury to find Susan guilty. When Selden tried to ask the jurors what they thought, Hunt sent the jury away without a verdict. "Has the prisoner anything to say why sentence shall not be pronounced?" he asked. Susan rose from her chair. "I have many things to say," she began. "You have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government." The judge tried to silence Susan, but she would not be quiet. When she finally finished her accusations, the judge ordered her to pay a $100 fine. "I will never pay $1 of your unjust penalty," Susan declared. She promised to continue to rebel against your man-made, unjust, unconstitutional forms of law that tax, fine, imprison, and hang women while they deny them the representation in the government. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. "Madam," the judge replied, "the court will not order you committed until the fine is paid." This made no sense. The judge was telling Susan that unless she paid her fine, he would not put her in jail. Judge Hunt knew that if he didn't put Susan in jail, she could not ask another court to look at his decision. In this way, he kept her from taking her case to a more important court. That's what Susan wanted to do. Instead, the judge closed the case. Susan never paid a fine or went to jail. She also didn't get to fight in a higher court for the right to vote. Susan's trial had put the question of women's suffrage on the front page. That was a victory, but Susan could not enjoy it. Her sister Guelma became sick with tuberculosis. Susan, Hannah, and Mary cared for her together until she died. Susan was in no mood to travel, but the revolution's massive debt still hung over her head. She went back to work on the lecture circuit. Chapter 8. New Frontiers. In 1876, the United States celebrated its 100-year birthday. At the local celebrations in Philadelphia, Susan asked if the National could present a Declaration of Women's Rights. The organizers said no. The National did get a handful of tickets for members to sit on the platform. Susan listened to the Declaration of Independence being read. Then she stood up and presented the Women's Declaration to the pale, surprised man leading the ceremonies. Anyone watching would have thought it was part of the show. The women even passed out copies to the crowd. This was the second big victory for Susan that year. A few months earlier, on May 1st, 1876, she wrote in her diary, "The day of Jubilee for me has come. I have paid the last dollar of the Revolution debt." She had paid $10,000 plus interest nearly all by herself. A month later, Susan was at Elizabeth's house in Tenafly, New Jersey. They rummaged through old papers and newspaper clippings. The two friends couldn't believe how times had changed since they first started their fight. It was no longer shocking for women to speak in public. Women went to universities and worked at more jobs. Some women even had partial suffrage. They could vote in a few U.S. territories and some local elections. Suffrage organizations existed across the country. More people joined every day in record numbers. Many of the new women's rights activists were black, like the journalist Ida Wells, who spoke out for the rights of women and all African Americans. Susan and Elizabeth decided to write a book about the history of the suffrage movement. They threw themselves into the project. Elizabeth's daughter, Hattie, was called in to help. She was amazed at the way the two women worked. Sometimes they would seem on the verge of never speaking to each other again. Then they would go for a walk arm in arm. Elizabeth said, "Nothing that Susan could say or do could break my friendship with her, and I know nothing could uproot her affection for me." Ida Wells. Ida Wells was born in 1862 as a slave during the Civil War. She went on to become a journalist, newspaper editor, suffragist, and, along with her husband, Ferdinand Barnett, an early leader in the civil rights movement. In the years since the Civil War, black women had started to demand their rights as free citizens. Women's suffrage had become more and more a popular idea, but unfortunately, even in the women's movement, many people still opposed racial equality. Ida Wells traveled internationally, speaking out on behalf of equal rights for women and men of all races. Susan had always valued her friends. She valued them even more now that she had lost two of her sisters to tuberculosis, first Guelma and then Hannah. The women's movement had become like a family to her. At 57, Susan was not as sprightly as she used to be, but she was still unstoppable and focused on her goal. From 1877 to 1883, she went from state to state to campaign for women's suffrage. She returned to Washington, D.C. each year to speak to Congress. The first volume of Elizabeth and Susan's History of Women's Suffrage was published in 1881. When the second volume was published a year later, Elizabeth went to Europe to promote the books. Susan had crisscrossed the continent of North America many times, but she had never crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Susan decided to make the trip with Rachel Avery. Rachel was 25 and one of Susan's nieces. The nieces were young women new to the movement who looked up to Aunt Susan as a role model and hero. Dozens of banquets and receptions and honors celebrated their departure for Europe. Susan and Rachel left America on the British Prince on February 23, 1883. When the ship arrived in England, a friendly face was waiting on the dock. Elizabeth, on the tiptoe of expectation, was there to meet her. "I came up to London the moment I heard of your arrival," she told Susan. Susan stayed in Europe for 9 months. During that time, she helped form an international council of women where representatives from different countries could work together. She found that women in countries such as England, Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany were not so different from those in the United States. In November 1883, she set sail for home. She'd made many new friends, allies, and admirers abroad. Thanks for listening to Chapters 7 and 8 of Who Was Susan B. Anthony? Based on everything that you've heard and what you know about all the things she's done in her life so far, how would you describe Susan B. Anthony as a person? What do you think she would be like if you met her today?